Us. I'm Diane Rehm. FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler proposes regulating the Internet as a public utility. In his confirmation hearing, Ashton Carter casts himself as an independent defense secretary, and vaccinations become a political hot potato and photo op for presidential hopefuls. Joining me for the domestic hour of the Friday News Roundup, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal, Tamara Keith of NPR, and Michael Scherer of Time. And throughout the hour, as always, you are part of the program. Join us on 800-433-8850. Send us an email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter. And happy Friday to all of you.
Thank you.
Happy Friday.
Good to see you. Jerry Seib, another strong jobs report.
A very strong jobs report. Actually, I'd say the strongest that we've seen in a good while, and one where it's hard to find any bad news. This is the jobs report for January, just a few numbers that tell you what's going on. So the economy added 257,000 jobs in January, which was above expectation. And anything over 200,000 is basically a positive report. But the news got better when the report went back into December and January. Those numbers were revised up. So the average job growth for the last 3 months is now 336,000 by these new numbers, which is very strong. In November, the job growth was 423,000 under the revision. Wow. And the private sector job growth in November was the highest that we've seen since 1997. Average earnings, and this is maybe even more important, average earnings went up 2.2% in January. So wages, which have been the problem and stuck, in low gear, that's not a great increase, but it's better than the rate of inflation, and it's a pretty good number and a sign that maybe it's not just jobs, but wages are finally starting to move too.
So what does that tell us? What do all these good numbers tell us about what the administration is doing?
Well, I think the first thing they tell you is that you still have to be cautious because, we've been through false starts since 2008, and this could still be another one, but it seems to be sustained now because it's lasting for a while. I think it probably tells you that there's been a lot of pent-up demand by both consumers who've held off purchasing things and by businesses which have held off investing and hiring until they felt confident. And I think what it tells you is there's a kind of a sense of confidence arriving. Part of that is the lower oil prices for sure, and the administration doesn't have much to do about that. But there's kind of a steady as she goes approach here that seems to finally be paying off. And I can only think that the administration and Democrats must be wondering where were these numbers 6 months ago when it would have helped us in the election.
Tamara Keith, what about the Fed? How might these numbers affect their thinking?
I think that they have been sort of holding steady, but have been looking for signs like this. I think they will continue to hold steady for a while, but certainly they've been looking for wages, and this is one report and one small gain in wages. Wages have certainly not kept up at all.
And that's what the Fed is worried about. They want to see wages increase more before they'll raise interest rates. Well, Michael?
They're looking at wages and jobs and inflation and trying to find the balance between that. I think more than the Fed, what the political class, especially the president, wants to see is an increase in wages. He just came off the State of the Union declaring last year a breakout year for the economy. I don't think most Americans felt it was a breakout year. They felt it was better maybe than worse years that have happened recently. And that is because for most Americans, the key number is not the unemployment rate, it's the income, the median income rate. And most Americans are more tightly strung now than they have in a while. And the hope here from the White House to the Fed to Congress is that tightening labor force will lead to increased wages, and that the middle class of this country will finally begin to benefit again after more or less a decade of stagnation.
Tamara.
Yeah, I was out in Elkhart, Indiana a couple of weeks ago doing a story about the economy, and this is an area that was hardest hit in the recession, highest unemployment rate. They make RV capital of the world. And I was talking to employers. They all had signs up saying help wanted, and wages hadn't kept up there. Wages were still low, lower than they had been. But the employers I talked to were saying, well, we're going to have to start paying people more money here. because we simply can't find enough qualified people to work. So, I mean, that's in a microcosm, the sort of pressure that could build as unemployment comes down and more people are working and employers have to start doing things to entice people. It suddenly becomes a buyer's market or a seller's market, whichever it is.
And meanwhile, the Obama administration unveiled its budget. Are there, I wonder, Jerry Seib, opportunities for agreement with Republicans on some issues?
Not many. There's definitely more disagreement than agreement. There are two areas I think there's potential for agreement. One is both sides actually want to push up defense spending. They bust the ceiling that's supposedly in place on overall spending so they can spend more on defense. The argument will be on the domestic spending side. I also think there's the potential for an agreement on a kind of corporate tax reform that pays for more infrastructure spending. That was a big piece of the president's proposal. He's proposing to do that in a way that's different than anything Republicans will buy into. He wants a fairly big tax on overseas earnings of of American corporations overseas, and then use that money to pay for infrastructure spending at home. But the idea of changing the tax code to bring in some taxation on overseas earnings and using that to pay for what everybody agrees are badly needed infrastructure improvements, that general idea, that general approach is a bipartisan one at this point.
Michael.
But bipartisan, and I think everybody would agree, overdue. And then there's the larger subject of corporate tax reform, not just the overseas income part. I think what Obama and the Congress are going to be up against is a feeling among lobbyists here in Washington and also among a number of Republicans that if they just hold out 2 years, they might get a Republican president. And if they have a Republican president and Republican control of the House of the Senate, they can basically reshape the tax code as they wish. And so there is, it's totally possible it happens this year, but there's also, I think, a lot of reasons why Republicans would hold fire on a compromise that might be difficult to sell to their bases.
And by the way, if you're just joining us, you can see our guests if you go to drshow.org and you can watch live video. What about the FCC chair, Tom Wheeler, on net neutrality, Michael?
This is just the most remarkable drama we've had all year in Washington. You have one of the top 4 or 5 most powerful industries in this town, the cable television and telecommunications industry, which has been as aggressive as anyone in recent years. Compare them to defense, compare them to the technology sector, at throwing money at politicians, at hiring top lobbyists, at building enormous infrastructure in town, creating grassroots groups, advertising on television, to push the idea that that we can have a future of broadband internet that does not require this sort of government regulation. And what happened was Tom Wheeler last year tried to find a compromise. There was a backlash among a number of smaller groups, as Jerry's newspaper has reported. Companies like Etsy, which don't have significant power in Washington, were able to exert themselves at the White House. And the president came out late last year and said, as I promised in my campaign in 2007 and 8, no one's going to be stronger for net neutrality than I am, and we are going to recategorize how we deal with broadband. And so now Wheeler has proposed something which no one would have predicted a year or two ago. A reclassification of broadband so that it will be regulated like our telephone lines are regulated now. And what that means is that there will be enormous protections for internet companies who want to go online so that they don't have to pay extra fees to broadband providers to get their content into homes.
And what's it going to mean for me as a consumer, Jerry?
Well, it's not going to mean much in the short term. In the long term, it means that the big players in providing content, the Netflix of the world, can't cut special deals with the broadband providers. And one of the arguments is that mean that you won't get as good a deal in the long run as a consumer? The flip argument is, if you don't let the little guys thrive on the internet, you don't have all the innovation. You don't get Etsy, you don't get Uber, you don't get Tumblr. These new internet innovations don't come quite as quickly. So that was the tension. It was a tension between the big guys and the little guys to some extent, but also between the people who provide the pipe into your home and the people who put the stuff into the pipe in your home. And it was the a battle that was underway, as you suggest, until the White House put its finger scales on the side of the little guys.
But now it's got to go forward to 4 other commissioners, Tamara.
Well, and there's a whole rulemaking process.
Yeah.
Just because the FCC chairman writes a blog post and says, here's what I want the rule to be, then there's a process and nothing happens overnight.
And how long is that process going to take? When is the final announcement to be done?
I don't think we have these things tend to get pushed off, but I do think, the betting money now is you have 3 Democratic commissioners, and Tom Wheeler is the most moderate of the 3. They form together a majority of the FCC. And the idea that the other 2 Democratic commissioners will go against their chairman and the president of the United States is rather slim. I think the question now is whether Congress decides later this year to pick it up and try and step on what the FCC is doing.
Michael, share time, short break here. And when we come back, your calls, your comments, I look forward to hearing from you. And if you're just joining us, you can watch live video of the Diane Rehm Show News Roundup. Just go to drshow.org, click on Watch Live Video. Here's an email about the employment numbers, Michael Share. It's from John in Louisville, Kentucky. Please comment on the fact that the CEO of Gallup this week said the unemployment numbers the press uses are basically fiction. Real unemployment rate, when you include those who left the workforce, is over 11%. When you factor in additionally people who have only part-time work seeking full-time work, the numbers are even more stark.
It's definitely true that there are more people working part-time now than want to be working part-time. And there is still a lag from the recession that the country is catching up with. I think what the email is referring to is a Gallup poll of labor force participation, which is a different measure. It's saying what percentage of the American public or the adult population are choosing to be a part of the labor force right now. And it is true that that is down from historical norms. The biggest chunk of that decrease, though, is right now because the population is aging and we have the baby boom population getting older, so more people are retiring. So that has a big part of it. There is a lag still from the recession that we're catching up with, but I don't think any of that means that these reports are not good. I mean, we're clearly moving in the right direction. I think it's fair to say, though, that we're not quite back at zero from before the recession.
Sure.
And if anybody wants to look, the Labor Department does also put out a second reading on unemployment every month. It's a broader version. It includes involuntary part-time workers and people who are only marginally attached to the labor force. They're not looking all the time. And that number stands at 11.3% in January, was 11.2% in December. So that number is there. You get the same movement generally in that number as you do in the one that's more generally newsed.
So who's making a big deal out of this, Jerry?
Well, people who think that the fact that people have moved out of the workforce and that there are many discouraged workers, and who think that the movement in the employment sector has been toward part-time workers, not full-time workers, think the numbers underplay the actual stress in working America. And to some extent, that's true. But again, you can get a different reading, the one I just used, and you can get a sense of that as well. I don't think the overall trends are disputed or are all that different in the two readings. And as Michael suggests, every month we look at labor force participation to get some sense of how big that problem is.
Okay, let's talk about the Department of Homeland Security and funding. Therefore, Democrats seem to be blocking a vote on this.
They are in the Senate. So basically what happened is last year when Congress passed a bill to fund the government through the end of this fiscal year through September, Republicans wanted to hold back funding and just make it temporary on the Department of Homeland Security because they wanted to be able to use that funding as leverage to try to make some sort of a statement on the president's immigration executive actions. And so now that temporary funding is about to run out at the end of this month, and they're trying to figure out how to make that statement, how to do something, how to undo the president's executive actions. And so over in the House, they passed a Department of Homeland Security funding bill that also completely undoes the immigration executive actions that the president took, also takes away the Dreamers, the action that the president took about 2 years ago on young people who were brought to the country by their parents, and the Dreamers provision is actually pretty widely accepted, and there are several Republicans in the Senate who don't even really want to have to vote on that because they don't want to be seen going against the Dreamers. I mean, they're called Dreamers. So this bill that the House passed on purely Republican votes basically goes over to the Senate and runs into the reality that is the Senate, which is that the Republicans in the Senate don't have enough votes amongst themselves to do whatever they want, and Democrats are blocking it. And they've blocked it 3 times in 1 week, basically saying, we're not going to undo the president's executive actions on immigration.
But we need a Department of Homeland Security to be funded, Michael.
Yes, and the clock is ticking. So by the end of this month, if something is not passed by both houses, there will be a partial government shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security. What that'll mean is that a lot of people working at the Department of Homeland Security will stop getting paychecks, but most of them will still be going to work. So it won't mean that the borders are no longer guarded immediately. But it will over time become a crisis, and it will become an immediate political crisis if it happens, I think, for Republicans. Because Mitch McConnell came in to the Senate last year after winning, saying we're not going to do government shutdowns anymore, and John Boehner was very much on board with that. And I don't think there's many people at the White House who are sweating they're going to lose politically on this.
So how do you get beyond this impasse, Jerry?
I think that probably they have to separate the two issues: a continued funding of the Department of Homeland Security, and they can continue to cast votes that will ultimately be symbolic more than real, that say the president shouldn't do immigration reform unilaterally. Meanwhile, as Michael says, most of the functions of the Homeland Security Department are considered essential functions. They will roll ahead even if technically the department isn't funded, because they're considered essential services.
And the great irony is that the part of the Department of Homeland Security that would implement the president's executive actions is funded through fees and wouldn't be affected by the non-funding of the Department of Homeland Security.
So it's the funding is going to be there for essential jobs.
For essential jobs and for the deferred action. For the thing they hate, the Republicans are most upset about. The White House has rather ingeniously structured it in a way so that it's funded without the help of Congress. so they can continue to have it go forward.
Everything. I mean, we heard at the beginning of this year that there was going to be cooperation. What happened, Jerry?
Well, there has been some. There's been more. This not on this subject,
Okay.
but there has been a little more cooperation, and some things are starting to move. The Senate actually, functioned reasonably well on some nominations. It's there have been amendments offered and voted on, and bills passed, and so this one sticks out. It's not going to be a subject that Republicans will ever say, "Well, I guess the president was right to do what he did on immigration." So, but you shouldn't be totally distracted by this show, because there are some other areas where there's been some cooperation.
All right, let's talk about Ashton Carter, his hearings for confirmation as Secretary of Defense. How did he do?
I think he did pretty well. He generally got bipartisan support, not a lot of complaining. He's a fairly well-respected figure. He probably did himself some good by showing a streak of independence. He seemed a little more willing, for example, to provide lethal aid to the rebels in Ukraine than the administration has been so far, and that plays well with a committee run by Republicans.
Do you think he would have said that without permission from the White House?
It's a great mystery. It's hard to say. Given Ashton Carter's background, I think it's entirely possible he might have. But on the other hand, I think he's just front running the White House only a little bit, because the administration is moving in that direction on its own anyway.
How much of a team player is he?
I think he's very much a team player. I don't think he's being hired at the last 2 years of a two-term presidency to be an independent voice as much as a very effective bureaucrat. This is a guy who's been the Pentagon's top weapons buyer. He was a deputy to the last two secretaries of defense. He's very well known on the Hill. His big issue in these hearings was funding and the restructuring the Pentagon for the decades going forward, so that there is enough money in the right places to ensure national defense. The tone of the hearings, he got some criticism for the Obama administration, but it wasn't really about policy. The Republicans are still very upset about Obama's policy, but they weren't putting it on Ashton Carter.
What about Gitmo?
He made it seem like it would be hard to close Gitmo, and obviously it would be hard to close Gitmo given what Congress has passed and given all the limitations. He seemed somewhat less committed to it, let's say, than the man at the top in the White House. I think the real question for him, as has been with every defense secretary, is whether he'll face the same frustrations that Leon Panetta faced, or that Bob Gates faced, that where they feel like they just aren't part of the inner circle, and they don't have the kind of sway that they would want to have. And those names, Leon Panetta and Bob Gates, were much bigger names, bigger personalities, came in with their own heft in a way that Ashton Carter, skilled bureaucrat, will get things done kind of guy, he doesn't come in with the same sort of name.
So how likely is he to be a really independent player?
It's been, as Tamara indicates, it's been hard for anybody to be an independent player in this administration. It's a very White House-centered decision-making process. So I think the odds aren't all that great. On the other hand, in the last 2 years of an administration, things tend to loosen up a little bit. People have a little bit more freedom as the A team at the White House gives way to the B team, and the C team, the people around the president, aren't as powerful as they were at the beginning. So you never know. And, people come into office sometimes in Washington and you think, well, that's going to be a weak appointment. And then they stand up and assert themselves. So you can't be sure.
All right. There are reports that Democrats may skip Netanyahu's speech before a joint session of Congress. What's the latest on negotiations there?
Well, there's not much negotiations. Netanyahu made very clear, and his ambassador, Ron Dermer, has made very clear that they're going to go forward with this, and that they're not very concerned about the fury over at the White House about a foreign leader coming to address the U.S. Congress and to argue against the administration's goals without having told the White House. The initial break here was that the Israeli government never told the White House that they were going to accept this invitation. And actually,
And Representative Boehner never told the White House he was being
and the ambassador to
invited.
Israel over the weekend, over Super Bowl weekend, tweeted, breaking protocol, choosing sides, go Patriots. So he was making fun of the fact on Twitter that he had broken protocol and enraged the White House. And this is the ambassador of Israel. So that gives you a real sense of the level of diplomatic engagement here if the ambassador from the country is openly mocking the rage over at the White House. And
this is, of course, also right before Israeli elections, which is why the president says he won't meet with the prime minister. There might be other reasons, too. It becomes this question of whether Israel is playing partisan politics here. And choosing the Republicans over the Democrats and the administration, and the idea that some Democrats may not show up to this speech or may be too busy, it is an indication that it has gotten very partisan.
What about Vice President Biden?
Well, that's the other interesting question. Will he show up? I mean, normally as the titular president of the Senate, he would come and sit in the chair and listen, and I don't know whether he will or not. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. You know, it's the politics runs both ways here. Are the Republicans, by giving Prime Minister Netanyahu this forum 2 weeks before the Israeli election, basically endorsing him and giving him this forum 3 weeks before the deadline on the Iranian nuclear talks? That's what's really got the White House upset, because it seems to be an attempt to tilt the scales in the nuclear talks.
And one more visitor now coming to Washington to address joint session of Congress, Jerry.
The Pope.
The Pope.
That one won't be so controversial. I think that'll be a consensus choice.
And that's going to be a tough ticket to get.
Absolutely.
Oh, my goodness, I should say. And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. I have in front of me a photograph of a friend that everybody knows. This is Rand Paul getting an injection, a booster shot for measles. And I find myself wondering why he invited the New York Times to come along.
And let's just say it was actually a hepatitis A shot, the second in a series. He was not getting a measles vaccine, but I think he was getting inoculated against political damage.
Criticism. Yeah.
So what he did is he went on a radio show, and then he went on CNBC, and he said that it's a matter of liberty and freedom, and that parents should be able to choose whether their children get vaccines or not. Of course, many state laws basically say that. They allow pretty broad exemptions for personal belief. Where he took it one step further is he said that he's heard of many, and I don't have the exact quote, walking, talking young people who get a vaccine and then have profound mental disorders. Now, that is an allusion, at least, to the study that has been thoroughly discredited and was thoroughly discredited about a decade ago, saying that the measles vaccine could lead to autism in children. He later sort of walked that back in conversations with the New York Times and said, oh, people are just totally misunderstanding me. And now 400 newspapers are jumping on saying, with all their headlines, he's saying, oh, no, I had just said that I had heard that. I didn't say that I believed it. But he discovered quickly what happens when politics and science collide.
It's also an early fascinating test for a presidential candidate, Rand Paul. He has a lot of these positions that are libertarian positions that are very far outside the mainstream when they're presented squarely, that he has been saying a lot of times over the last decade. I mean, he's quoted from years ago saying that mandates and mandatory vaccines are a step towards martial law. I don't think most Americans believe that. The idea that we should all have vaccines, that if I don't have a vaccine, I'm actually putting your children at risk, is pretty widely accepted now. It's interesting in his backpedaling here and his being photographed. He said the liberal media misunderstood what I said. I'm totally in favor of vaccines, but he never said back down from the position that the government should not be mandating the vaccine. He does this a lot of issues where he tries to spin his position in a way that makes it broadly palatable. I think he found out this week that as we get closer and closer to a presidential race, the risks of doing that will be higher and higher.
And you mentioned states, Tamara, that do allow parents to opt out, but California has now introduced legislation to end the rights of those parents to exempt children based on personal beliefs. And the other thing that worries me is that there are a couple of infants in Chicago who have now been diagnosed with measles. How in the world, when everybody keeps saying it was Disneyland, how has it traveled to a hospital?
Well, people go to Disneyland, they fly home on a plane from LAX and go to Chicago, and there you are. And, by the way, the infants are the ones most at risk because they haven't been vaccinated yet. And that's the problem that a lot of people see as a public policy issue here.
Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal. When we come back, we'll talk further, take your calls. I look forward to speaking with you. And welcome back. On that measles outbreak, Cook County officials said the source of the infection of the infants there is unknown. And it's unclear if those cases are linked to the measles case last month in the suburbs or to the measles outbreak linked in Disneyland. Let's open the phones now. First to Michael in Peoria, Illinois. You're on the air.
Hello, thank you.
Sure.
I'm flabbergasted that I got on.
Okay, go right ahead.
With regard to the funding for the Homeland Security, I'm getting really tired of all this back and forth in Congress. I'm kind of thinking the president should say, although he can continue to pay the people that are essential, I don't know why he doesn't just say, fine, guys, you don't want to fund this department. Let's just give everybody a couple of months off and see what happens. I know Congress would be up in arms, the people would be up in arms, but perhaps it's time for him to become far more aggressive with the people that are obstructionists.
All right, Michael, share.
There would be a bold move. The reason the president can't do that is that he has a responsibility to protect the nation, and he doesn't want to become culpable in whatever lapses happen. History tells him also that if he just waits, the pressure will build. We had a big government shutdown a couple years ago. President Obama went out and gave speeches about why this was the wrong thing, and exactly what many political observers predicted would happen beforehand ended up happening. The pressure built on the people shutting it down, and eventually they had to cave. And so I don't know if the president has to go out and make such a bold move. It will be harder to do non-essential things with Homeland Security. If you interact with them, there will be less work done. It will hurt over the long term in terms of planning and hiring and other things like that. And that will begin to build up, and there will be lots of stories about that, and the pressure will come.
Though what I've heard talking to people on the Hill is that the most likely outcome is if they can't figure out a way out of this box canyon, they'll at least do some sort of temporary funding extension so that there wouldn't actually be a shutdown.
Let's go to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Hi there, Riley.
Hi.
Go right ahead, sir.
In regards to the vaccine issue, I have a background in microbiology. I did vaccines in the military, and I have 2 small children, so it's something I think a lot about. I think a lot of the conversation is around this connection to autism, and that's, it's going to be up in the air for a long time, but something more important is how well our vaccines are filtered for contaminants, but also for things like nanobacteria, which are extremophiles and are now being related to a lot of health issues. And I feel like a lot of focus is given to the autism connection in a way to not play in on a much more prevalent, concerning issue, which is the contaminants that might be in them.
All right, Tamara.
Well, I don't know the science there, but what I will say is that in polling, the Pew Research Center has looked at this, and they have found that the people who are most concerned about the safety of vaccines are not necessarily the wealthy. They're not necessarily liberals. It cuts through all socioeconomic and ideological areas. The people who are most concerned about the safety of vaccines and least concerned about the dangers of the diseases are young people. People who have never had to live with these diseases being present in their lives. People who don't have relatives who are deaf because of the measles or who have a limp because of polio. People who've never experienced these diseases. Feel well their risk analysis is different than the risk analysis of people who've lived this.
But you still have to think perhaps not only about oneself, but how your lack of vaccination is going to affect others.
Well, but those people are thinking most people are vaccinated. These diseases aren't prevalent. And they're willing to sort of be free riders on other people's vaccinations.
One of the things you get a lot in these public policy debates about science is that science is not able to rule things out 100%, right? Experiments don't work that way. When we had Ebola, people would ask, well, if I was sitting 10 rows ahead of someone who may have met with somebody, is it possible that I could have gotten Ebola? Yeah, it's possible, but enormously unlikely that it would have happened, and it never happened. I mean, we didn't see evidence of that. And in vaccines, similarly, there is reason to research the safety of vaccines. There's reason to be concerned about all sorts of different things, but the science right now is conclusive that if you do the risk-benefit analysis, the risk is enormously higher to not vaccine. Much more damage is done than to vaccine, and so that question is kind of closed.
Did Jeb Bush come out in his speech on vaccines, Jerry?
Well, I think he said what lots of Republican mainstream candidates have been saying, which is, yeah, I think that getting vaccinated is a good idea. But as we've been noting, that's actually separate from the public policy question. How stringent should the requirement that parents vaccinate their kids be? That's the real question. And I think there was a real live test of that in Mississippi this week, where they were attempting to loosen up the requirement, and that got voted down. So in the court of public policy and public opinion, things went the other way this week a little bit. But on all these things, and you mentioned Ebola, Michael, that there's a kind of inevitable balance between private rights and public safety. And in Ebola, the question, should that woman in New Jersey have been quarantined or not? Well, that was an open question for days and maybe weeks. And that's the balance here that people are trying to strike. But that's a public policy question. That's not a personal responsibility question.
So did Jeb Bush give any further hints about his quote consideration, Tamara?
Well, he definitely was acting like a presidential candidate, and talked repeatedly about the right to rise, which is the name of his political action committee, but will likely be a theme of his presidential campaign. He talked about the challenges that he will face as someone with the last name of Bush. And was rather charming, actually, when talking about, if somebody wants to be critical of my father, then I'll take him outside unless they're 6'4", heavier than me and younger, in which case let's negotiate. He definitely was, he had a teleprompter. He was he was doing the presidential candidate thing.
Interesting. And with Mitt Romney's dropping out, how does that open the field for others, and who's most likely to get in there, Michael?
Well, Jeb is the big winner of that contest. When Mitt Romney got in, or said he was thinking again of a third presidential campaign, it was really a challenge, mostly behind closed doors among high dollar donors and Republican Party staff and establishment figures.
The two actually met, didn't they?
The two met.
Yeah.
They talked actually in December. They share strategists from years back. I mean, there's a lot of overlap in their worlds. And the fact that Jeb was able to keep his cool, keep doing the meetings, build support, poach staff during this whole process, and eventually Romney just looked around and said it's just going to be too hard to pull this off. I think the winner there is Jeb. A secondary winner is Chris Christie, because with both Jeb and Romney in the race, his space was much smaller where he could run, especially in terms of raising lots of money from wealthy Republicans.
Anybody else?
Well, I think the others, the down ballot, if you will, guys, sort of benefit a little bit too, because to the extent there were going to be more, I'm sorry, they're harmed a little bit, because to the extent there were big ticket guys at the top dividing up the vote, that made a small percentage down the line look bigger and more important than it's going to be. Now you're going to have a couple of big figures and everybody else fighting for the rest of a somewhat smaller pie, I think.
All right, let's go. Lots of questions on vaccines. Let's go to Eric in Freeport, Illinois. You're on the air.
Hi, Diane.
Hi.
Hi, long-time listener, first-time caller. I just have a question that I can take my answer off the air.
Sure.
But, I have two family members that have both decided to opt out of the measles vaccination, and their kids are now 7 and 5, and now they're thinking, maybe they should. What are the concerns at this age, and what would be the advice? If you've gone this long without it, is it good to do it at a younger age? Should you do it now?
Tamara.
I am not a medical professional. My husband's a veterinarian, but that's not enough. But what I can say is that my understanding is you can get the vaccine at any time. There's the only advantage to getting it earlier is you're protected from measles, mumps, and rubella earlier. But there's I've heard NPR has reported on people who had been opposed to vaccinating their children who have rethought it and have gotten their children vaccinated. So my understanding is that you can, with no real consequences, do it when your kids are.
So Eric, talk to the doctor and find out. I think that's the best way. I wish all of our journalists were physicians as well, but
so do our parents.
Sadly. All right. I have a question to ask of all of you, because his name, a newscaster, highly regarded anchorman, Brian Williams, has himself made news this week. What are we hearing?
For years, Brian Williams, the anchor of NBC News, has been telling various versions of a story about a decade old, or more than a decade old, of the initial invasion in Iraq, in which he was in a helicopter convoy. The way he told the story previously was that he was in a helicopter in which the pilot got injured. It had to land. It took RPG fire and small arms fire. And he would always tell the story as a way of praising the troops around him, but also as embellishing his own journalistic credentials. I mean, he had been a reporter in a war zone under fire. So he would go on David Letterman and tell this story. It turns out now we know that there have, as long as he's been telling that story, been soldiers who were in that convoy who have been pretty upset with Brian Williams because their memory of what happened was very different from his. The helicopter that actually was forced to land by RPG fire was not the one Brian Williams was traveling in. There's a question of whether the helicopter he was in ever took fire. Other details of his story didn't check out. And this week he had to come forward and say, I got it wrong. The story I've been telling isn't right.
So how come we're just hearing from these soldiers, these people who were with him now?
He had posted something on his Facebook page, I believe it was, either his or the NBC Nightly News Facebook page, in praise of veterans and retold this story.
Oh, I see.
And then some of the people who were on the helicopter that took the RPG fire went on and started commenting on that post on Facebook, and then Stars and Stripes followed up, and then he was forced to apologize.
But had they never come forward earlier?
Not to my knowledge. I think that was kind of interesting and surprising, and maybe they tried to and nobody listened.
Yeah.
But this time people listened. So I think it's, look, I think this is the hazard of journalists entering the stories they're trying to cover. I think it's a lesson that journalists ought to try to stay out of the story that they're reporting, not become part of the story, because, that's not what your role is. Your role is to be an observer and a reporter, not a participant in the news itself.
And if you're someone like Brian Williams, you're not just a journalist who reports every night. You're the head of a very almost like an entertainment property. You're the figurehead of a marketing machine that is selling NBC News over CBS and ABC. And clearly that's what tripped Williams up. I mean, he was trying to sell himself on late night TV shows and at fundraising events and things like that. And he let the facts get away from him.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Let's go now to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Hi, you're on the air. John?
Hello?
Yeah, you're on the air.
Hi. Wow. Hi, Diane. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I have a comment about vaccines. It's the way this debate seems to be posed is that anyone who has any critical thinking about vaccines is, anti-science and going in the face of science, and maybe similar to how someone who questions our own government is labeled as unpatriotic. I'm
not sure those two things are at all analogous, frankly, John.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm saying is that me being not an anti-vaxxer, but somewhat critical of the vaccine schedule and the pharmaceutical companies, what I would actually be advocating for is not less science, but more science.
Sure.
And more research. And in fact, the CDC itself has expressed that they feel there's more of a need for research in the potential connection between early vaccines in infants and asthma.
Well, if we had a Congress that put enough money into research, we might get somewhere.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any field of science where we don't need more science. And I think clearly there are questions to be answered still in the vaccine realm. But you have to also say in the next sentence that there has been a lot of science done about the question of the harm, and the harm has not been found. So it's not an untested thing. And we've had, if you go back, the first mandated vaccines were about smallpox, which is a disease that doesn't exist anymore. In Boston in the 1800s. In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that states could mandate vaccines with no exception. So this is not a debate that is in any way new. And if you go back through American history in the 1900s, people had very similar concerns. They were talking about personal liberty at the turn of the century. And all the science that's been done from then up to now has consistently shown that the big harms that are feared here are not real, and the benefits are enormous.
I would just want to chime in on the politics again, and Jerry sort of alluded to this, but there's a thing happening where, like Hillary Clinton tweeted out, the science is in, the earth is round, the sky is blue, and vaccines work, or something like that. And there are a number of politicians who are very carefully talking about how great vaccines are, but they aren't talking about whether they should be mandated or more mandated, or whether personal belief exemptions should be taken away. There are any number of politicians who were asked about it and gave answers that seemed semi-satisfying, but don't actually wade into that very sticky political public policy fight.
Very quickly.
There's also another question here about the vaccines that are not mandated. There are lots of vaccines out there for HPV, for the flu, that have been shown to work, but we don't mandate. And there is a real, totally legitimate public policy debate about whether they should be.
Friday News Roundup, measles. You have to come in here as medical experts. Michael Scheer of Time, Tamara Keith of NPR, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
And thanks for listening, everybody. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture,